All right, this next lecture is going to be about the digestive system. So looking at an overview of the digestive system, there's two big things to consider here. There's a long tube that runs through the body, starts at the mouth, goes all the way through the body and comes out at the other end. And then that's known as the gastrointestinal tract, sometimes called the GI tract. And then we have all these accessory organs associated with it, like things such as the teeth, all these glands up here that secrete saliva, the liver, the pancreas. Those are all Gall Bladder. Those are all considered as accessory digestive organs. So we have the GI tract, and then we have all of the accessory organs. So functions of the digestive system include all of these terms, and I'll just kind of run through the list. So ingestion just kind of means bringing things into the body. Digestion refers to breaking things down that you've taken into the body. Propulsion is talking about moving things through the GI tract. And so there's two strategies that your GI tract uses here. So we have something called peristalsis, which is due to wave-like contractions of the intestines. And you can see there's like these wave-like contractions of the smooth muscle, and it pushes things through. And then we also have segmentation. So segmentation is more like mixing and kind of chopping up stuff as it goes through the gastrointestinal tract. Secretion refers to glands secreting things into the GI tract to help with digestion. So this could be something as simple as saliva that's going into your oral cavity to help start breaking things down. As far as absorption, as you're probably well aware, a lot of the food that we eat is absorbed in the intestines, and that's how we get it into the body. And then what's not absorbed is eliminated as feces. So starting at the top, we'll re-examine the oral cavity. You've seen this a few times before. We'll add a few new features this time. So this is your oral cavity. It's basically inside your mouth. So it's lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Your teeth are here. They help with mechanical digestion. There's also a lot of enzymes in the oral cavity due to the salivary glands, which we'll get to. And the enzymes help chemically start breaking down some of the substances that you put into the body. The vestibule refers to this little pocket right here between the teeth and the lips. And then the oral cavity is just this. Oral cavity proper is just the main region of the oral cavity. Labia refers to your lips. Gingiva refers to the gums. Hard palate versus soft palate. So the hard palate is basically everything, the roof of the mouth that's formed by bone. You can see that goes a little more than half of the way back. And remember, that's formed by the maxilla and the palatine bones. And then we have the soft palate back here, which is just soft tissue. The uvula is kind of at the end of that soft tissue. It's a little tissue piece that hangs down. And when you swallow, it tends to push back to try to prevent things from going back up into the nasal cavity. The fauces just refers to the opening that the food goes through at the end of the oral cavity. And then the tongue is this big mass of skeletal muscle that helps with voice production and also digestion. So back to the salivary glands, which I mentioned, we have three pairs. They secrete what we call saliva. Saliva is important because it has an enzyme called salivary amylase. And salivary amylase starts breaking down food as soon as it goes into your mouth, in particular carbohydrates. All right, so there's three pairs. We have the parotid up here near the ear. We have the submandibular down here beneath the mandible. And just beneath the tongue, we have the sublingual. So we're going to look at the teeth, because the teeth are very important accessory structures in the oral cavity. And first of all, chewing, which your teeth are involved in, is called mastication. And if we look at the anatomy of a tooth, we see all of these things. So let's start kind of on the surface. The part that you see is called the crown of the tooth. The part that's deep in the gum is called the root. And then there's a little constricted region right here called the neck. So we got the crown, the neck, and the root. The teeth fit into little sockets called dental alveoli. You may remember that from when we talked about the cranial bones. And if the inside of the tooth is formed by this substance called dentin. So dentin, this yellowish substance, forms the inside of the tooth. The crown of the tooth is actually covered by a substance called enamel. Enamel is the hardest substance in the human body. So enamel on the crown of the tooth, dentin in the middle. Lining the dentin around the root, we have this little tiny layer called cementum. So cementum. And then if we look inside the tooth, we have a cavity. This is called the pulp cavity. And blood vessels and nerves get into that pulp cavity by going through these two little canals called root canals. And they get into the root canals by going through these little openings called apical foramina, if you're talking about more than one. And the last thing that I do not have listed right here, but it is important, all of these ligaments that hold the tooth in place are called periodontal ligaments. So this word right here, periodontal ligaments. All right, so that's the anatomy of a tooth. Now we get to learn the teeth and their names. So for baby teeth, also called deciduous teeth, if there's 20, they come in anywhere from 6 months to 30 months, and then they're eventually replaced by permanent teeth. Adults have 32 permanent teeth, and we're going to run through their names really quick. This is actually really easy to get because you don't have to learn all 32. You just have to learn 8. Because if we go down one side here on the top, it's the same thing on the other side and same thing on the bottom on both sides. So it kind of goes like this: central incisor, lateral incisor, canine. So those are your first 3. So central incisor, lateral incisor, canine. Then we have first premolar, second premolar, and then first, second, and third molar. The third molar is also known as the wisdom tooth or wisdom teeth. So to run through that again: central incisor, lateral incisor, canine, first premolar, second premolar, first molar, second molar, third molar, also known as wisdom teeth. And so if we do that on each side and top and bottom, that gives us 32. All right, there's lots of membranes associated with the GI tract. We have the peritoneum, which is a serous membrane that surrounds a lot of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Some organs are within that peritoneum, some are behind it. So intraperitoneal organs are organs that are within the peritoneum. Retroperitoneal organs are found behind the peritoneum. But remember, the peritoneum is just the serous membrane. It has visceral and parietal layers. It gets a little tricky if you look at this, so I wouldn't have you identify the different layers, visceral or parietal, but they're there. And then hanging off of the peritoneum, you get these little membranes called mesenteries. The one that sticks out the most is this one called the greater omentum. So it's a big flap that kind of hangs down the front of the abdominal area. There's also a lesser omentum and mesentery proper, but you won't have to identify those other than potentially the greater omentum because it's right there in the front. So these are just membranes hanging off of the peritoneum. So layers of the GI tract, if we take a given section of the GI tract, whether it's the stomach, esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, it's going to have 4 layers to it. And so we're going to go through the 4 layers, and then we'll talk about how these 4 layers may differ a little bit depending on what part of the GI tract you're in. So if we start at the inside where the food would be, we have the mucosa. So the mucosa is epithelial tissue. Throughout a lot of the GI tract, it's going to be simple columnar, but it does change a little bit depending on where you are. And there's a little bit of smooth muscle in there called the muscularis mucosa, which you can't really see in this picture. So the mucosa would be lining this inner lining. The submucosa is the next layer, and the submucosa has a network of nerve called the Meissner plexus, and that's what you can kind of see right here, also known as the submucosal nerve plexus, but Meissner plexus is the big name that people use. and that just allows some of the smooth muscle in there to contract. And then we have this really thick layer called the muscularis, and this is where the bulk of the smooth muscle is. And so there's, in most parts of the GI tract, they're going to have two separate layers of the muscularis. You'll have an inner layer where the fibers run in a circular fashion, and then an outer layer where the fibers run longitudinally, or in this case, up and down. And so that gives you, the GI tract, the ability to kind of use either that peristalsis method that we talked about earlier, or segmentation. Segmentation would be the more circular fibers. Peristalsis would be the longitudinal fibers. Then there's, as you can see, there's also a network of nerves here called the Auerbach plexus. All right, and the outermost layer is commonly known as the adventitia, or sometimes the serosa. And you can see there's blood vessels there. Not a whole lot else to say about it. So as far as the blood vessels and nerve supplies of the digestive system, the blood vessels that bring in oxygenated blood would be like the celiac trunk that you've learned about, superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. As far as the lymphatic tissue here, there's lacteals that absorb fats. There's Peyer's patches, which are part of your immune system, found in the ileum of the small intestine. Then there's lots of nerves. We just saw some plexuses, and the plexuses are of the autonomic nervous system, meaning we don't think about it, it's under unconscious control. So kind of moving through the rest of the GI tract, we have the esophagus, which is kind of like a tube that is where food is going to go after it goes down the pharynx. So remember when we were talking about the respiratory system, after air went down the pharynx, it went through the larynx. Well, this is where you don't want food to go down the larynx. So you want, after food goes down the pharynx, and it would go through the same pharynx that we talked about with the respiratory system, it's going to be directed into the esophagus by the epiglottis. You remember the epiglottis kind of covers up the larynx to prevent food from going in. So things about the esophagus, it's basically a long tube lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. There's a lot of elastic fibers in there that helps get things through. There's some muscle in there. There's a little bit of skeletal muscle in the esophagus to help with swallowing. And there's two sphincters. And so remember, a sphincter is a ring of smooth muscle. So the superior esophageal sphincter is at the top. It kind of regulates what goes into the esophagus. And at the bottom, before food goes into the stomach, it has to pass through an inferior esophageal sphincter. And remember, these just regulate how quickly food can pass through. So after the esophagus, food's going to go into the stomach. The stomach looks like this. It looks like kind of like the letter J. And found in the left upper quadrant, just below the diaphragm. The stomach is important at turning food into chyme. So one thing that we're going to note about the stomach, it is very acidic. It has some hydrochloric acid in there. So the pH of the stomach is really low. So when food gets there, it's broken down rapidly by this acid. And it's going to turn food into this gooey stuff that's commonly called chyme. So looking at the anatomy, here's your esophagus, here's the stomach. So there's four parts to the stomach. When food first enters, it's in an area called the cardia. Then it's going to go through this big region called the fundus. Then it's going to pass through this big, large area down here called the body. And then lastly, the pylorus is this last thin little section. So those are the four areas of the stomach: cardia, fundus, body, pylorus. The pylorus has a sphincter here called the pyloric sphincter that regulates how quickly food goes into the small intestine. And the opening is called the pyloric orifice. So sphincter is the smooth muscle, orifice is the opening. Other anatomical features of the stomach, the two curves you get here, this is the lesser curvature, this is the greater curvature. And all of these little squiggly things, like kind of like wavy little structures inside the stomach, are called rugae. So rugae inside the stomach. Looking at the histology of the stomach, so it's simple columnar epithelium. there's these little pits called gastric pits. They have glands in there that secrete stuff, which we'll get to next. The muscularis of the stomach is really unique because, as we said earlier, most sections of the GI tract have 2 layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis. Well, the stomach has 3. So it has an inner layer that is oblique, has fibers running at an angle. Then it has the middle layer that's circular, the outer layer that's longitudinal. So the stomach has this extra little oblique layer that allows it to contract a little bit more than other areas of the GI tract. And if we look at the cells that secrete things in the stomach, we have mucus cells that secrete mucus, parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid, which has a very low pH that helps break down food. This is why the stomach is so acidic. And intrinsic factor, which is a substance that's important for the absorption of vitamin B12. So other cells, chief cells, secrete something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is important in the breakdown of protein. And then we have these enteroendocrine cells, which secrete a hormone called gastrin, which basically gastrin stimulates the parietal cells to release the hydrochloric acid. So all these cells work together to maintain the pH and regulate some absorption in the stomach. All right, moving down to the small intestine, there's 3 parts to the small intestine. The duodenum is first, followed by the jejunum, followed by the ileum. So there's not a whole lot. We'll get back to this major duodenal papillae. You don't need to really know how long these things are. Ileum has something called the ileocecal valve, which regulates the flow of things from the ileum into the large intestine. But for the most part, just kind of know the order of these. So looking at the small intestine in general, you see a lot of what are called microvilli, which you increase the surface area. But before we get to the microvilli, it gets a little more complex than that. So you have if you look at the small intestine like this, like if this is the lining, you get these big folds called plicae circulari, or sometimes called circular folds. And then on those big folds, you get these smaller structures sticking up like these things. These are called villi. Singular would be villus. And if we zoom in on one of those, it's going to look like this. So this is one villus. And you can see that each villus has an artery or arteriole, a venule, and also a lacteal for fat absorption. Then on top of the villi, you get these tiny little things that we've seen before called microvilli, and they form that brush border that helps increase the surface area. So between the villi, you get these little kind of pit-looking regions. These are called crypts of Lieberkühn, and you have some goblet cells in there that secrete mucus, some more enteroendocrine cells. And so that's kind of the structure of a villi. And so it's kind of a hierarchy of these folds. So you get the big circular folds, then you have the villi, and then on the villi, you have the microvilli. So all of this dramatically increases surface area for maximal absorption. So other unique things about the small intestine, in the duodenum, which is that first part, you have these glands called Brunner's glands that secrete some mucus, and this is one way you can identify through a microscope what part of the GI tract or what part of the small intestine you're looking at. If you see the Brunner's glands, you're looking at the duodenum. Alternatively, there's Peyer patches, which you've heard of before, in the ileum, and those have an immune function. That's a mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And then cholecystokinin is a hormone also released in the duodenum. It stimulates both the pancreas and gall bladder to start releasing their secretions, and we'll talk about those shortly. So moving on to the large intestine. The large intestine is kind of your last chance to absorb stuff. So it absorbs a lot of water and a lot of electrolytes. So water and electrolytes being absorbed here is really important. So anything that's not absorbed here in the large intestine is eliminated as feces. In the parts of the large intestine, right when the ileum empties into the large intestine, you get this little pocket right here called the cecum, and that's the ileocecal valve right here. Hanging off, you've seen this before, you have the appendix. So there's the appendix, that lymphatic tissue. And then the large intestine is going to go up, across, down, little curve, and then out. So this gives us the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then lastly the rectum, and then the anal canal. So another word, as you may have figured out, for the large intestine is the colon. So that's why this is called ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoidal colon where it curves. Then we have the rectum and anal canal. So looking at closer at the large intestine, you can see that it has a little strip of smooth muscle on it, which causes it to kind of bunch up a little bit. And I'm just going to pull back so you can see this a little bit bigger. So this is a strip of smooth muscle right here. This is called the tinea coli. And it kind of bunches the large intestine up into these little ball-looking structures. These are called haustra. So haustra are the kind of rounded structures. Tinea coli is the strip of smooth muscle. So longitudinal layer of the muscularis, so the smooth muscle, forms the tinea coli, giving us haustra. And when you're absorbed or digesting food, you can get the tinea coli to contract, and that's going to cause those haustra to move a little bit and help move things through. And they call that haustral churning. All right, so more accessory structures here. The liver, which is really important, found in the right upper quadrant, has 4 lobes: right, left, caudate, and quadrate. So the right is this big one, left is here. And when you turn it around, you actually get 2 more. So quadrate and caudate. The way you can tell the difference, the quadrate's always going to be on the side of the gall bladder. Then you have left and right. So quadrate, caudate, right, left. So ligaments associated with it, we have the falciform ligament, which is this big thing in the front, in the left and right. The round ligament kind of hanging off the bottom right here. And then in the back you can see the ligamentum venosum, which is a remnant of that ductus venosus from the fetal circulation. And porta hepatis is just this area where everything enters the liver, not overly important. Here's another picture identifying it. So round ligament is also called the ligamentum teres, and it's labeled as that ligamentum teres here also in this picture. So round ligament and ligamentum teres, the same thing. Ligamentum venosum, falciform ligament, those are the big ones. And this is a good picture that kind of shows how the fetal circulation turns into the adult circulation. So we talked about some of these before, like ligamentum arteriosum with the cardiovascular system, fossa ovalis. But like we said, the ductus venosus turns into the ligamentum venosum. The umbilical vein turns into the ligamentum teres, which is also known as the round ligament. And then those are the big things that we talked about. We didn't really get into the umbilical arteries with the digestive system. All right, so back to the liver. Remember, the liver's job is to absorb stuff and detoxify, basically figure out what to do with all the stuff that just came into the body. So the liver is divided into these units called lobules, and the lobules are divided by these little things called septa. And then the cells in here are called hepatocytes. They do a lot of things. They absorb nutrients. They produce something called bile, which we'll come back to, detoxification, and also making plasma proteins. And so looking at the blood flow through the liver, you've seen this with the cardiovascular system. We talked about this. You get blood coming in. So when food is absorbed, things come in through the intestines. They come in through the hepatic portal vein. They're going to pass through these sinusoids and exit via the central vein. So as the blood is flowing through these sinusoids, the hepatocytes in here decide what to do with all of it. In addition to the hepatocytes deciding what to do with the stuff, you also have these macrophages called, phagocytic cells called Kupffer cells. They help break down anything that could be harmful. As we've seen before, we have these vessels. So we talked about the hepatic portal vein. We also have a hepatic artery. We also have a bile duct, which we'll get to next. So the bile duct is important because as blood's flowing through here, the hepatocytes can produce something called bile. That bile will flow through these bile canaliculi into the bile duct, and that's on its way to the gallbladder to be temporarily stored. So we'll talk about the gallbladder next. So to recap, I think I hit everything on here. Hepatic artery, we talked about bringing oxygenated blood. Hepatic portal vein, bile duct, sinusoids, Kupffer cells, bile canaliculi. All right, so the gallbladder collects bile that was produced in the liver. And so coming from the liver, it comes through here, and then the bile is going to come through here, and then enter what's called the cystic duct to be stored in the gallbladder. So cystic duct leads to the gallbladder. And when you need bile in the GI tract, the gallbladder can contract. It has smooth muscle in it, and that bile can go down the common bile duct and enter the duodenum of the small intestine. So bile is important for absorbing fat. It helps break down fat. And so if you eat something with a lot of fat in it, your gallbladder is going to be extra busy sending all this bile to help break it down. So key point, as bile is coming into the intestine, it goes into the duodenum, and you have this little area right here, a little expanded region called the major duodenal papilla, and it's just a kind of a raised region where the common bile duct comes in. All right, then we have the pancreas. I know we've seen the pancreas before, but now we're going to talk about its digestive function. So the islets we've talked before about, so that's releases insulin and glucagon. But now the rest of this, the acini, secrete digestive enzymes. So the digestive enzymes that are secreted are called pancreatic juice, and the pancreatic juice is going to flow through these pancreatic ducts and basically enter at the exact same place where the common bile duct came in and emptied bile in. You're also going to get that pancreatic juice emptied in right here. And so when they merge together, so the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct, you're going to get this expanded region called the ampulla. This is called the ampulla of Vater. So ampulla of Vater right here. I know they call it hepatopancreatic ampulla, but this classic name is the ampulla of Vater. And there's a little sphincter in there that regulates the flow coming into the duodenum, and that's called a sphincter of Oddi. And like we said, the little raised region inside the duodenum is called the major duodenal papillae. And here's a bigger picture of that showing how the common bile duct from the gallbladder and the pancreatic duct fuse together, merge together, form the ampulla of Vater. The sphincter in there would be the sphincter of Oddi, which is not labeled. And the bump right here is the major duodenal papillae.